the experience of the Indian American diaspora, I think, is a huge wake-up call. It's a huge warning. I mean, at one point, the Indian American diaspora was being celebrated. You know, no one talked of the Indian diaspora in Europe. It was always
Right.
the Indian American
America.
diaspora as this model minority, and they're doing well. They're the highest earners. All that was talked about. And then suddenly there was a volcanic eruption of racism,
Yeah.
anti-Indian sentiment. And this really seems to have caught people by surprise.
You're on Strat News Global. I am Surya Gangadharan. Welcome to another edition of The Gist. And this time we're going to focus on immigration, immigration, right-wing extremism in the context of Europe, and of course, terrorism. And I have with me a Europe-based scholar, Prem Mahadevan, who focuses on these issues from his perch in Europe. Prem Mahadevan, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you, sir. Always a pleasure to speak to you.
Prem, we were talking a little earlier where you mentioned that there's been a lot of Indian students moving to Europe, specifically to Germany. And it appears in some cases these movement of students is not working out perhaps in the interests of either the Germans or Indians. What is it that you can tell us about this?
Well, sir, I would specify that I think by and large both sides would say it's a positive thing. So now what we are talking about is therefore individual experiences, and that
Yeah,
is important.
yeah.
So there's a trend, and then there's the counter trend to that. So if one looks at it, Germany is a aging society. They need about 400,000 new workers annually just in order for the population, the working population, to be stable. And
Hmm.
the arrival of Indian students and skilled workers, I think, has been welcomed by the German government. So they are positive about it. And I think German society, by and large, is reasonably accepting of
Hmm.
this trend. Now, the issues, I would say, I'd use the word issues, come down to often, the question of, say, cultural assimilation. A lot of the times when Indian students go abroad, they go abroad with certain expectations of how life
Yeah.
would be like, and it takes a while for them to really adapt to the different customs of a certain society. For example, what is the natural volume level while speaking?
Mm.
Just to give
Yeah.
one very basic example, how
Mm.
clearly do you speak? How often do you say please?
Mm.
Is smiling considered a sign of shiftiness and crookedness, or a sign of politeness?
Yeah.
Even those small things make a difference. Now, coming to more serious issues, actually, sometimes Indian students can go abroad paying their hard-earned, or their parents, often their parents' hard-earned money, which has been got by taking loans on property or selling
Mm.
property, whatever. And then they find that the university they've gone to is something of a degree mill. That
Mhm.
the certificate they get isn't really worth much in the local job market. It's not really a European degree as such. It's just one more sort of educational certificate out there, and they're not really entitled to any privileged entry into the job market. So that can be a source of disappointment, and for the host society as well. Europeans, I think, have often envied the United States, that the United States really attracted the best brains from the world, especially during
Mhm.
World War II and immediately after World War II. So they would like to think that the people they have coming to Europe are the elite,
Mhm.
the creme de la creme of whichever society. And oftentimes these are, they're not the dregs, but they're also not the elite. They're very much middle class, hardworking people whose main offering is their work ethic, the fact that they're ready to work long hours, but they're not
Yeah.
necessarily leaders in their respective fields at the time they arrive in Europe as students. So I
Mhm.
think this sometimes leads to the sense that, okay, we Europeans think we're accepting the best from other countries and cultures, but we find that we're accepting raw material which we have to train up and build up. And why can't we do that for our own people instead? Why don't we give our
Mhm.
own people better opportunities than foreigners? So those are the kinds of thoughts and sentiments, I think, which are floating around.
So, generally, in the media and so on, is there any resentment, any expressions of, about Indian students coming in? I'm referring specifically to students, or or are they welcoming? What is the general sense?
I think the general sense, when it comes to the media, there's, as far as I'm aware, there's no expressions of hostility towards Indian students or Indians whatsoever. I think
Mhm.
Indians are not in any way problematized in Europe. When it comes to social media, the scene is different, because Indians sometimes do talk about discrimination in the labor market, especially in
Mhm.
the housing market. The housing, I mean, difficulty of getting accommodation sometimes is pretty severe, actually. Um, I I have heard anecdotally, people being told that, look, they've found that when they've applied for a vacancy, in an apartment or even a job, they've really sensed that it has come down to their nationality or their ethnic origin, which has sort of
Mhm.
disqualified them from being considered. Um, so I would say that one would really struggle to find something in mainstream media or commentary. Social media gives indications of some challenges, but then there are
Yeah.
always, counter arguments that, look, it's a mixed bag everywhere.
Mm.
That's how things stand. Yeah.
But by and large, would you say Indians who come there, skilled workers who come there, are decently paid, get a good wage?
Oh, yes. I mean, if you look at it, Indians in Germany are the highest earners on average, actually, even
Uh-huh.
more than the Germans, even more than Americans. So that's actually a great credit to Indians and their work ethic and also their skills. I
Mhm.
wouldn't say there's any sort of discrimination or problem on that front. I think the issue often comes down to what is the larger sense of acceptance. I mean, you can be
Mhm.
welcomed as a technical, skilled professional for a limited period of time, but
Yeah.
often, especially in certain European contexts, it's understood that you are very much there as a guest. You're not planning to stay there, and your kids are not going to grow up in that society, because then there are all kinds of questions. How much are particularly Central European societies, which did not benefit from colonialism, benefit in the
Yeah.
past? I mean, we're talking about the British and the French, we all know, got rich on the back of basically looting other countries. But
Mhm.
Central Europe didn't really have that. So, when you have these societies, they say, we don't carry any burden of guilt with us. We should not be expected to be as accepting of other cultures and migrants from other lands as the British and the French and the Dutch. I mean, these people have
Mhm.
something to prove to the world, that they are not racist because of what they did in the past. We have nothing to prove to the world, and we should not be held to the same standard as them. So this
Okay.
also means that Central Europeans do say that, look, I mean, they don't say we have a right to racism or xenophobia, emphatically not. That is,
Mm.
but there's a thought process that we should not be expected to go out of our way to accept foreigners. I mean, the foreigners who
Yeah.
come here really have to understand that it is they who must adapt and assimilate, actually.
Mhm.
And one could argue that that's perfectly fair, actually. I mean, historically, there's no
Mhm.
burden of proof on these countries to accept
Yeah. Yeah.
foreign workers. It's purely economic logic.
Mhm. So, would you say that, based on the recent experience, that Indian workers are generally doing well in Germany?
I would say they're certainly doing well. The question, which I'm kind of more concerned about, is where would this go some years down the line, actually?
Uh-huh.
Because the experience of the Indian American diaspora, I think, is a huge wake up call. It's a huge warning. I mean, at
Yeah.
one point, the Indian American diaspora was being celebrated. You know, no one talked of the Indian diaspora in Europe. It was always
Right.
the Indian American
America.
diaspora as this model minority, and they're doing well. They're the highest earners. All that was talked about. And then suddenly there was a volcanic eruption of racism,
Yeah.
anti-Indian sentiment, and this really seems to have caught people by surprise. Now, what is worrying is there are ideological linkages between the European and the North American, specifically the US right wing scenes. So in the United States, there is a novel that was originally published in French in the 1970s. And this novel explicitly dehumanizes Indians. I mean, it
Hmm.
describes them in the most debasing, the most racist terms imaginable. The author was a Frenchman, probably picked on India because he was perhaps a little worried about legal action or political controversy if he dehumanized some other culture which France had colonized in the past. So India
Hmm.
was colonized by the British, so he targeted Indians
Fair
expressly.
game.
And in his, sorry,
Fair game. Huh?
yeah, yeah. So in his novel, he basically describes a huge maritime invasion of Europe by Indians, and
Hmm.
he describes it as the death of European culture and so on. Now, this novel has had a significant resurgence in popularity since 2015, since the last 10 years, ever since the migrant crisis of 2000, when
Hmm.
Angela Merkel basically allowed in people from the Middle East. Now, those were Middle Easterners, not Indians, but the fear of civilizational erasure, what Trump's national security strategy has
Hmm.
talked about actually lately, that really is something which is very strong in certain quarters. And I think the mistake which Indians could make is to thinking that because India and Indians tend to have, so far India has had a positive image in the world, Indians are seen as a model minority, the speed with which things can turn around very fast, against India, and the manner in which the same workers who are praised for their work ethic can tomorrow be called job stealers, a term which has become
Hmm.
very popular in America, in
Hmm.
right wing, xenophobic, and racist American circles. I wouldn't rule out that that can come into Europe as well, because when people see foreigners coming in and getting well paid and moving into a middle class lifestyle, while the working classes of that society are still struggling because of social immobility, that is not going to go down very well. So I think in the
Yeah.
longer term, there are going to be bigger problems. How those are navigated will, of course, come down to the host governments as well as the individual immigrants or workers themselves. How well they assimilate into those societies, and if their
Hmm.
own professional lives give them the opportunity to do so. Oftentimes, if you're working as a technical person in whichever field or whichever profession, your whole life is centered around that existence. So you really don't have
Yeah.
too much time to engage with the local society at a deeper historical, cultural level. It's
Yeah.
a luxury which working people struggle to afford.
Hmm. So there's the AFD in Germany, the Alternative for Democracy or whatever. Are they, from what I've been given to understand, they have not expressed any sentiment against skilled immigration. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. So the AfD is a rather smart group, actually. The Alternative for Deutschland,
Deutschland.
Deutschland being the German name for Germany. So the AfD came up in 2013 as a Eurosceptic party. So they were critical of the handouts that were being given
Mm.
to Greece, basically by the German taxpayer through the EU. And then in 2015, the migrant crisis blew up, actually. So the AfD rather smartly pivoted towards this issue. Now, the strength of the AfD's messaging strategy is that it does, although it heavily problematizes migration and seizes on every instance of terrorism or violent criminality to sort of signal that the existing party system in Germany is not running the country well. The core
Mhm.
message of the AfD is better security for the German people. That's not something that people normally can argue with. You know,
Yeah.
um, the great the great advantage for the AfD is, no matter who commits an act of violence or political violence in Germany, whether it's jihadist terrorists or whether it is right wing extremists, the AFD still benefits because both
Mhm.
contribute to insecurity. And then it's just a matter of intelligent framing to say that, look, all this is a result of our society being pulled apart from within because the political leadership that is running this country doesn't know its job. Now, in Germany, there is something called the firewall, where the mainstream political parties don't work with far right parties. So the AFD is basically, for a long time, it has been sort of ostracized politically, but it's growing in strength significantly to the point where it cannot be ignored. Now, the AFD has claimed that it is not against skilled migration, and it has no problem with Indian workers coming into the country because Indians contribute to Germany. I
Mhm.
would say that there's a little bit of ambiguity which has been deliberately left in because, I mean, no party is going to really get very far if it uses purely logic. There'll always be an
Mhm.
element of emotion, emotional manipulation in any political party's messaging. So sometimes one of the ambiguous points about the AFD is they say that, millions of people who shouldn't be in Germany should be sent back. The problem is that the number of people actually who would be illegally staying in Germany and who should be sent back are not that huge. So the question is,
Mhm.
what does this millions really apply to? There's some ambiguity. You can interpret it the way you like. So I would say the AFD is almost certainly not got a problem with Indians per se. But then there would be the question of whether any country, Germany or anyone else, is going to be happy to have its population, its working population, being quietly, having to quietly coexist with foreign workers
Mhm.
coming in simply because their own demographic is aging slowly.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing which will trigger insecurity in every country and culture.
Mhm. Mhm. But the AFD is not known to have. I mean, are they talking about the Turks in Germany? Because they've been there for decades.
Indeed. So here's where things get a little murky. Between 2000 and 2007, there was a series of murders which were committed in Germany, 10 murders in total. Eight were of Turkish origin people, one was of a Greek, and one was a German policewoman.
Mhm.
So this was over a 7-year period. In 2011, it came to light that these murders were committed by a right wing terrorist cell. And that created a bit of a scandal because the German media had covered the murders of these people, particularly the Turks, as being related to gang warfare. We now
Mhm.
know in hindsight that they were targeted because of xenophobic, racist instincts on the part of the
Mhm.
perpetrators. But the media framed these killings as if it was as if the victims were somehow to blame. Now, what is, I think, important in these particular cases is that, if you really study how the German media portray acts of terrorism, you know, right wing violence is often portrayed as the work of or as the action of a lunatic, of a
Mhm.
psychologically unbalanced individual. A lone wolf, there can be really no explanation for what he did. But if a similar action is carried out by somebody of a migrant background and a migrant background with, from certain parts of the world, it's
Mhm.
usually framed in the context of a larger political movement or a larger political threat. So, the AFD doesn't need to really do anything here. The media environment in itself tends to create
Mhm.
a mindset of besiegement, of being beleaguered, that there are threats which are trying to get into our society or are already among us. So then all you have to do is basically say, look, let's then take action against these threats. Let's not pretend we can coexist and move from one incident to another.
Mhm.
I would say that one of the most alarming aspects of right wing violence in Germany is that a favored tactic which has been used for over decades is arson attacks. Now, this is important because, when we talk normally of terrorism, we talk about certain incidents like, say, shootings, bomb blasts, sometimes knife stabbings, and lately it's been the use of vehicles to ram people in crowded environments. But arson attacks are a little more problematic because they can be deliberate or accidental. And a lot of the time, right wing groups do not leave paraphernalia around, and they do not issue a statement of responsibility. So that
Mhm.
means that, the intended victim knows perfectly well he has been hit, or their families know who is behind the attack.
Mhm.
But in the absence of a smoking gun, the media, the police, the host society can always say, no, this may not have been racially motivated. There may not have been a
Mhm.
political agenda to this. Maybe it was just pure criminal vandalism or hooliganism. So there can be an underestimation of the risk of right wing violence. And I think what one sees is that this is a much more diffuse threat. Therefore, it's harder to combat. The
Mhm.
AFD, I think, has been really heavily problematized, and there's a certain fixation, particularly in the Anglo-American media, on the AFD. I think the AFD is very much a symptom of a larger change which is happening within Germany. So to problematize them perhaps is to overlook the larger trends which are occurring as a result of,
Mhm.
as I said, an aging population and continuing immigration, both legal and illegal, into Europe.
Mhm. So the German population is getting more insecure and more defensive, perhaps, and it has no
Yes,
alternative to immigration.
well, sir, if you really look at it, the shock of Germany, I mean, once the strongest economy in the European Union and
Yeah.
really the most powerful, most populous country and so on, what have they found? Their economy has been doing very badly in the last few years, actually,
Mhm.
ever since COVID. And, the glory years actually have passed. Now, the thing is, Angela Merkel, when she famously decided to allow immigrants into Germany in 2015, those were really the very good years for Germany, right?
Mhm.
And her decision was as much an expression of confidence in Germany's future, that Germany can position itself as the natural moral leader of Europe. But
Mhm.
what we have seen is that the last 10 years led to growing tensions within Germany. I mean, this whole decision of hers was extremely polarizing. And
Mhm.
the AFD basically had runaway popularity. Now the Christian Democrats, that's Merkel's own party, has had to become more security conscious in order to keep the
Mhm.
AFD at bay, because otherwise they're losing
Mhm.
voters. People are saying that the mainstream parties are not looking out for the ordinary person's interests.
Mhm.
AFD's own position is that the mainstream parties are a cartel. They're kind of like a mafia, which is closed off the German political scene to any new talent, new ideas, um, and they argue that they should also be given a chance at government. And their growing popularity means that there are people who say that, yeah, maybe we should listen to these guys. So I would say that the Germans are also conscious of the fact that they were dependent structurally on Russia for energy and
Mhm.
trade. AFD has always tended to be a bit more skeptical of the idea that antagonizing Russia is a good idea.
Mhm.
They feel that there is a certain degree of dependence on Russia. So these kinds of uh, things make, or these kinds of policy stances mean that for some people the party is just simply cannot be accepted, cannot be mainstreamed, and for others they say, well, maybe these people are talking sense. And I think, for where many Germans would sit on this, it would often come down to their own personal experience. Just to make a point here, Eastern Germany is often associated with a lot of racism, xenophobia, and right wing,
Mhm.
politics. And the AFD tends to be quite strong in Eastern Germany, particularly in Saxony and Saxony-Anhalt and Thuringia, these three states in particular. But deadly violence against migrants, which would be called right wing violence, this has
Mhm.
also happened in Western Germany. So we can't, or the former West Germany. So we can't say that, that this is something which is very localized. I think it's a question of targets of opportunity, of, where there are more migrants, and oftentimes security seems to be weaker in rural communities, in small
Okay.
towns.
Mhm.
So those are the places where I think there's a stronger tendency towards feeling insecure. We must remember, in Eastern Germany, in some parts of Eastern Germany, as much as 80% of industrial jobs were lost following the end of the Berlin Wall, and the
Mm.
population moved out to West Germany. So these areas were depopulated, and they suffered a significant drop in their prosperity. So these kinds of trends as well would cause people to be doubly suspicious of outsiders when they come in.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Interesting. What about something like terrorism, like what we've known in India, a violent bomb blasts, everything we've seen? Germany has seen some of that, would you say? Europe has seen some of that.
Indeed, sir. But the risk profile for different European countries would vary. So, for example,
Mhm.
um, if you look at it in Italy, really the number one concern for many years was the mafia, criminal
Yeah.
violence. In France, it's more jihadist terrorism. In Germany, there is now concern about right wing extremism.
Mhm.
But you sometimes find that, like, I'm not sure if anyone remembers this. Just over 2 years ago, in December 2023, there was an attack in the Czech Republic by a gunman in the middle of
Yeah,
Prague.
yeah.
Basically, he killed 13 people, and there was seemingly no clear political motive for it. This seems to have just been a criminal lunatic guy who
Mhm.
was had some sort of homicidal fantasies. Now, such acts can occur. Actually, the problem for India is that Europeans tend to conceptualize terrorism really within a non-state framework. So they do not understand that the basic reality of terrorism in India, in South Asia, is that it is supported by one rogue state with an army that
Mhm.
is basically intent on destabilizing the region in order to keep itself the main power in that country,
Yeah.
in order to keep
Mhm.
democracy at bay. So this is something that Europeans struggle to process unless they are regional experts on South Asia, because their existing frameworks, whether it is the British with Northern Ireland, or the French or anyone else, it's always to associate terrorism with non-state actors, not state
Mhm.
proxies. And I think that is
Mhm.
one reason why India, to some extent, struggles to convey certain nuances of its own terrorism problem to Europeans.
Mhm. Do you really expect the kind of right-wing extremism to morph into a broader campaign of violence or terrorism against outsiders?
I think terrorism, so unlikely, because when something starts looking too much like terrorism, it can be clamped down on, simply because you know Europe is very heavily surveilled. This is a
Hmm.
technologically extremely advanced region, but the issue is that if violence or right-wing extremism can be concealed, then it's a question of police priorities. So, for example,
Hmm.
uh, the authorities in some states and in some provinces have said, in Germany, for example, have said that they simply lack the analytical capacity to understand the severity of the threat posed by different networks, a
Hmm.
different right wing network. So they have to prioritize. This will be true in
Hmm.
every security apparatus.
Yeah, yeah. Hmm.
But what you kind of see is that, say, so there was one particular group. It was considered a not it wasn't a right wing group. It was actually an ultra leftist group that was targeting right wingers, that was targeting members of the AFD. Okay, so this is
Hmm.
left wing extremism against AFD members. They worked on the principle that you should really beat people to a pulp but not kill them. Now, the thing is, the what is important about this is that police, unfortunately, in many parts of the world, first of all prioritize violence against themselves. So if anyone attacks
Yeah,
a policeman, they're going to come after you with immense force.
yeah,
Then it's like, if you go after rich middle class folks, that's also problematic. But if you start
yeah.
going after marginal communities, you know
Doesn't matter.
ultra leftist, ultra right wing members of the pop, underground, the sort of punk
Hmm.
underground or something like that, members of immigrant groups, then it's less of a priority. So during the 1990s, Germany went through what was known as the baseball bat years. And this is a horrible
Mhm.
term because you get a sense of what it means. There was a lot of street level violence against people, against immigrants, and against people who did not really fit into mainstream German society. People who could be considered like of having a different sexual orientation, or
Mhm.
just like ultra leftists. So these people were set upon, and they were often very badly beaten, in a few cases killed. But
Mhm.
this can be projected as an act of bullying gone too far, or street hooliganism. There's a tendency to sort of run away from whether it's a larger political phenomenon. And here's the thing: when it comes to Germany takes racism very seriously, because in
Mhm.
the German discourse, racism is associated with a certain regime which ruled the
Yeah.
country for 12 years, and which was a monstrous regime. So they like to, the Germans say, we take racism extremely seriously. They associate it often with anti Semitism, and anti Semitism
Mm.
is completely forbidden in Germany
Yeah.
today, rightly so. But the result of this is that, because of this tendency to simply say that we have made a fresh start since 1945. 1945 is year zero, or hour zero, Stunde Null,
Mm.
in German. The whole society has been re engineered from this point onwards. To then say that some of those old prejudices, which may have existed for centuries, might still exist in some way today, that is politically quite problematic. The burden of
Mm.
proof is very heavily on you to say that, look,
Yeah.
maybe we're not all
Mm.
that different from the past, because the
Yeah.
official
Mm.
narrative is we are completely different. We've turned the corner.
Mhm. So what you're telling me is that even if things are all right for Indians, well, okay, if you want to say immigrants, skilled immigrants and others, right now things may be okay, but you can't tell a few years down the road if the German economy does badly or there is some a blip on the horizon, then things could go worse.
I'm afraid, sir, that is the ever-present reality of living outside one's home country.
Yeah.
One simply has to factor this. There is no sort of historical determinism here. The rise of Donald Trump, the MAGA movement in the US, and the manner in which they have completely turned against Indians, including those who enthusiastically supported them,
Yeah.
actually,
Yeah.
uh, is a warning that one simply cannot take things for granted. I mean, what we are now facing a situation where it might actually be worthwhile to consider whether the United States as a nation and as a country is actually hostile to India, because there's
Yeah.
always been a presumption that the US would welcome India's rise as a democratic counterweight to China. But if the
Mm.
extent of right-wing populism in the US gets to the point where any challenge or any sort of potential
Competition.
undermining,
Yeah.
any
Mm.
competition actually is seen as unwelcome and to be squashed, then, to be honest, we're in a very different framework within which we have to operate. And I think, when it comes to Europe, I do feel that Indians are contributing significantly to Europe, and they would continue in the future. And I think Europeans do recognize this, and Germany especially. But, as an Indian ambassador in a European country once told me, there is a tipping point after
Mm.
which things turn very fast, and you go from being welcomed to being seen as not really
Yeah.
in optimal numbers. The numbers have gone beyond the optimal point. And then there can
Mhm.
be a few incidents of just cultural misunderstanding or something happening
Yeah.
which trigger people off. And in today's day and age, where there's a lot of vitriol online, from right-wing elements, uh, it's going to be quite difficult to really contain the damage which is done in terms of image, to India's
Mhm.
image. Physical violence and so on, I don't think we're talking about, but we're talking perhaps about a lot of, one would say the scope for mental abuse and
Mhm.
mental violence is much greater. it's often a lot of right-wing violence just takes the form of get out or I'll break your bones.
Yeah. Yeah.
Get out, or your family is going to get it from us. And
Hmm.
that's pretty much enough. Immigrants tend to be very threat sensitive. So, if they feel the state is not backing them, if the
Yeah, yeah.
authorities are not taking their complaints seriously because no one's been killed yet, that's
Mm-hmm.
enough to send a message that, okay, maybe I better go from the small town to a bigger city where I'm safer.
Anonymity. Yeah.
Exactly, sir.
Okay. Prem, we have to leave it at that. It's a very interesting what you've told me, and I mean, to those of us who have relatives and others in Europe or even in the US, these are very disquieting times. Thanks very much for your perspective and your analysis. It lays bare the ugly side of immigration and what could happen to immigrant communities. Thanks very much, Prem. Great talking to you.
Always a pleasure talking to you, sir. Thank you for the opportunity.
That's all we have for you on this edition of The Gist. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media. Thank you very much.